The fastest plane of World War II wasn't forged from steel or aluminum. It was made of wood. In the winter skies of Europe, German pilots radioed headquarters in disbelief, their voices rising with panic as a strange wooden silhouette tore past them at speeds they thought impossible. "It cannot be British," some insisted.
It must be American, some secret weapon. Yet it was no American project.
It was the Mosquito, the so-called wooden wonder, a machine that began life as a dismissed fantasy but soon became one of the most feared and envied aircraft of the war. To German eyes, it seemed sorcery. To British engineers, it was a desperate gamble. To history, it became proof that audacity could rewrite the rules of battle. But when the idea first landed on the desks of the British Air Ministry, it was mocked as madness. A bomber with no guns, no armor, and a fuselage built from spruce, balsa, and plywood. In 1940, with Britain still reeling from the Blitz and its factories already stretched thin, many officials dismissed it outright. Lord Beaverbrook sneered that wood belonged in pianos and dining tables, not in machines meant to fight the Reich. Memos circulated with a cruel nickname, Freeman's Folly, a jab at Air Marshal Wilfrid Freeman, the only senior officer willing to back the design. His reputation, his career, even his credibility was suddenly tied to a dream many saw as suicidal. And yet Freeman stood firm. He saw what others could not, that speed itself could become armor, that agility might replace gun turrets, and that Britain's greatest advantage lay not in following convention, but in defying it. The Mosquito's designer, Geoffrey de Havilland, pushed his vision forward in workshops once used to build furniture, buses and pianos, repurposing Britain's carpenters into craftsmen of war. Against tradition, against skepticism, against even his own government, Freeman forced through an order for 150 aircraft before a prototype had ever left the ground. At that moment, Britain was gambling more than money or resources. It was gambling on an idea so unorthodox that if it failed, it would mark one of the greatest blunders in wartime aviation. But if it succeeded, it could change everything. In the spring of 1940, as the echo of Luftwaffe bombs still thundered over British cities, the Air Ministry was being buried under proposals for aircraft that might turn the tide. Most were conventional, more Spitfires, heavier Wellingtons, new prototypes that looked like every other machine of war already filling the skies. Then came Geoffrey de Havilland's audacious idea, supported by the stubborn will of Air Marshal Wilfrid Freeman, and it did not look like anything else. A twin-engine bomber with no defensive armament, no armored plating, and a fuselage crafted not from precious aluminum but from wood, spruce, balsa, and plywood layered together like something a carpenter might fashion in his shed. It sounded ridiculous to the ears of tradition. A warplane without guns was considered suicide. A warplane made of wood was considered lunacy. But Freeman, staring down opposition from his own colleagues, insisted that speed was a weapon in itself. If a bomber could fly faster than anything chasing it, it did not need to shoot back. If it could outmaneuver the very fighters sent to destroy it, armor would only weigh it down. The gamble was staggering. Britain would risk resources, manpower, and reputation on something that looked more like a racing craft than a machine of war. The ridicule came fast. Within the halls of the ministry, whispers turned to laughter. Freeman's Folly, they called it, a label that clung like tar to every memo and every discussion. Lord Beaverbrook, Minister of Aircraft Production, was among its fiercest critics. To him, metal was the only language of modern war. Aluminum was already scarce and steel was stretched thin, but to shift funds and men toward what he saw as a fantasy project was madness. Wood belonged in pianos, in dining tables, in the hands of craftsmen who carved furniture, not in the skies where Messerschmitts prowled. Yet Beaverbrook's scorn only hardened Freeman's resolve. He knew Britain's survival depended not on doing what was safe, but on doing what the enemy would never expect. Behind closed doors, Geoffrey de Havilland worked feverishly. His company's workshops, many of which had once produced buses and household goods, became experimental laboratories. Carpenters who had once sanded oak for tables were suddenly shaping fuselage frames. Piano makers accustomed to precision with soundboards were now gluing together aerodynamic skins. The Mosquito was not just an aircraft, it was an act of national improvisation, a marriage of old-world craftsmanship and modern engineering. And in that marriage lay Britain's chance to outthink, rather than outgun, the Reich. Letters passed between Freeman and de Havilland like lifelines, filled with urgency, doubt, and stubborn hope. "They call it folly," Freeman wrote, "but folly may yet fly." Every risk was magnified by the stakes. If the prototype failed to fly, Freeman's career would be over. If it flew but proved unstable, it could cost pilots their lives and Britain its already fragile morale. If it succeeded, however, it would prove something extraordinary. That innovation mattered more than convention, that speed mattered more than steel, and that the resourcefulness of free people could outpace even the most disciplined war machine. By December of 1940, with resistance still fierce, Freeman forced through an initial order of 150 Mosquitoes without a single combat trial. It was unprecedented. Never before had Britain gambled so heavily on an aircraft that the majority of its leaders still considered impractical. The decision sent ripples of disbelief through the ranks, shaking the foundations of the Air Ministry. It was as if the nation had bet on a racehorse no one else believed could even stand, let alone run. But behind the gamble was vision. Freeman understood what numbers alone could not capture, that Britain did not have the luxury of time, metal, or endless resources. What it had instead was ingenuity. Wood was abundant.
Skilled carpenters were everywhere.
The idea of building warplanes in furniture shops and coach factories seemed absurd only to those who could not see the larger picture. De Havilland and Freeman could. They imagined an airframe so light and sleek that it could outrun the Spitfire itself, powered by Merlin engines tuned to perfection. If such a machine could exist, it would not need turrets or armor. It would be invisible through sheer speed, a ghost in the skies that came and went before the enemy even knew it was there. That was the heart of the gamble, to turn weakness, lack of metal, shortage of resources, into strength by embracing what Britain still had in abundance. So the Mosquito became more than an experiment. It became a test of faith, faith in engineers, faith in craftsmen, faith in the idea that unconventional thinking could rewrite the rules of war. When the first frames began to take shape in Hatfield, it was as though Britain was building not just an aircraft, but a statement to the world. This was what free societies could do when pressed to the edge. They could gamble on imagination. They could risk ridicule. And if the risk paid off, they could shatter the certainty of enemies who thought them weak. Freeman's folly was no longer just a blueprint on paper. It was wood and glue, sweat and sawdust, taking the form of a machine that might, just might, change the course of the skies. On a cold November morning in 1940, under a pale sky that still carried the scars of air raids, the prototype Mosquito rolled out onto the runway at Hatfield. Its shape was unlike anything else in the airfields of Britain. Where other bombers bristled with gun turrets and defensive plating, this aircraft looked sleek, stripped down, and almost fragile. Its wooden fuselage gleamed faintly, layers of spruce and balsa sealed with marine varnish that glistened under the weak sun. To some, it looked like a desperate experiment. To Geoffrey de Havilland and his son, test pilot Geoffrey Jr., it looked like vindication waiting to unfold. Mechanics checked the twin Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, their propellers still and silent, while engineers whispered in tense anticipation. In the control tower, Air Ministry officials huddled with clipboards, their skepticism barely masked by thin smiles. They were ready to see a folly collapse under its own weight. But then the silence broke. The twin Merlins roared to life, their thunder echoing across the frosted airfield. The sound was rich and confident, a far cry from the timidity critics had attached to the project. The wooden airframe shuddered, then steadied as the engines reached full power. Slowly at first, then with gathering speed, the Mosquito surged down the runway, its fabric-covered wings slicing the air. Observers gasped as its wheels lifted free of the ground, the ungainly wooden prototype transforming in an instant into something graceful. For those watching, the moment was surreal. This was not supposed to happen. Wood was not supposed to fly like steel. Yet, here it was, climbing effortlessly, its engines singing in unison, carrying the hopes of skeptics and believers alike. As the aircraft banked over the Hertfordshire countryside, the truth began to emerge. The Mosquito wasn't just flying, it was flying faster than anything its size had a right to. On its first serious test runs, the prototype clocked over 380 miles per hour, surpassing even the Spitfire. Engineers below could hardly believe their instruments. One Air Ministry officer, scribbling notes in disbelief, muttered that the aircraft looked more like a racer than a bomber. De Havilland Jr. pushed the craft higher, testing its frame, its balance, its control surfaces. The wooden body responded with a smoothness that no one had expected, absorbing stress and distributing force in ways that metal frames often could not. Every turn, every climb, every dive confirmed what Freeman and de Havilland had staked there. Reputations on, speed was the only armor this aircraft would ever need. When the prototype touched down and rolled to a stop, the ground crew rushed forward, their faces split between relief and awe. The skeptics were silent now, their prepared criticisms drowned out by the roar of the Merlin engines still echoing in their ears. Reports sent back to the Air Ministry were cautious, but could not conceal the reality. The Mosquito was faster than expected, more stable than predicted, and utterly unlike anything in the skies. Its lack of guns, once seen as a liability, now seemed irrelevant. At speeds above 370 miles per hour, few enemy fighters could even catch it, let alone bring it down. The wooden wonder was no longer a joke whispered in hallways. It was a fact. Word spread quickly through RAF circles. Pilots who saw the YA test flights returned to their squadrons with stories that sounded like exaggerations. A bomber faster than the fighters meant to destroy it? A wooden airframe that could outpace steel? To the men who had flown clumsy Wellingtons through flak and Messerschmitt fire, the Mosquito sounded like a dream. But for the carpenters and craftsmen in Hatfield, for the piano makers now riveting fuselage frames, and for Freeman who had nearly been forced out for backing the project, the Mosquito was proof of something far greater. It was proof that Britain could still surprise the world. By the time the Air Ministry placed its first official order for 150 aircraft, the gamble already looked less like folly and more like foresight. Production ramped up quietly across Britain, in converted workshops and hidden facilities, with secrecy matched only by determination. Each Mosquito that rolled off the line carried not just spruce and glue, but the fingerprints of men and women who knew they were building something extraordinary. They were building speed itself, molded into wings, tuned with Merlin engines, and unleashed against an enemy that had laughed at the very thought of a wooden bomber. The first flight had proven the impossible. Now came the chance to prove it in war. When the first operational Mosquito squadrons took to the skies in late 1941, the Luftwaffe had no idea what was coming. To German intelligence, the wooden wonder was still a rumor whispered about in reports, but dismissed by senior officers who believed real warplanes were built from steel and bristled with guns. Yet the RAF crews who climbed into the slender cockpits knew they were about to test something radical. They carried no defensive armament, only bombs or cameras, and relied entirely on their speed. In the mess halls, pilots joked nervously that the Mosquito was either going to be their death sentence or their salvation. Once airborne, those doubts dissolved into adrenaline. At over 370 miles per hour, the aircraft felt alive, a razor blade cutting through the sky. The first missions were reconnaissance runs, slipping over occupied Europe to photograph German installations. Luftwaffe fighters scrambled again and again, but they arrived late, chasing contrails that vanished into the distance. Reports from German pilots grew increasingly frustrated. Impossible to catch, climbs too fast, gone before we reach altitude. The Mosquito had just begun to reveal its power. Then came the moment that would cement its legend, January 30th, 1943. In Berlin, sirens wailed as the wooden bombers approached at low altitude, engines howling across the city. Hermann Göring, scheduled to deliver a national radio broadcast to mark Hitler's 10th anniversary in power, was forced into humiliation as Mosquitoes dropped their bombs precisely on target, cutting the broadcast off the air. The timing was no accident. RAF planners had orchestrated it down to the second, turning Göring's voice into static under the roar of Merlin engines. For the German public, it was shocking. For Göring, it was an insult he would never forget. Night after night, Mosquito squadrons returned to Berlin, Essen, Cologne, and other key cities. Sometimes they carried bombs, sometimes they carried cameras, and sometimes they carried Pathfinder flares to light the way for the lumbering formations of Lancasters and Halifaxes behind them. Their versatility was unmatched. One day a bomber, the next a night fighter, the next a reconnaissance aircraft. To the Germans, it felt like the skies were haunted by a phantom. Luftwaffe diaries from the period are filled with bitter complaints. Interceptor squadrons were exhausted, burning fuel and pilots' nerves chasing shadows that could not be caught. Commanders reported morale collapsing as their men realized the truth. The Reich had no answer to the Mosquito. Göring himself grew obsessed. In one staff meeting, he raged that the British had built a beautiful wooden aircraft that every German pilot wishes he had. He openly admitted his envy, turning green, as one officer recorded in his diary. Yet his fury changed nothing. German industry, locked in its obsession with steel and its faith in heavy bombers, could not replicate what British carpenters and craftsmen had achieved. Every Mosquito sortie was a reminder of that failure. Even Hitler, who once mocked the project as Freeman's folly, now demanded reports explaining how a nation under nightly bombardment could still produce an aircraft so far ahead of its time. But explanations never came. The Mosquito was too fast, too versatile, too elusive to be countered. For RAF crews, flying the Mosquito was both a terror and a privilege. The aircraft demanded perfection. A single mistake on takeoff, a failure. To maintain speed above 172 miles per hour with one engine out could mean instant disaster. But for those who mastered it, the Mosquito offered something no other machine could: the ability to race past death itself. They flew into Berlin, into the heart of the Reich, and came back laughing, their cameras filled with images and their bomb bays empty. They knew what Göring did not want to admit. Britain's gamble had paid off. A wooden aircraft had just rewritten the rules of war. By 1944, as the Allies prepared for D-Day, Mosquitoes prowled across Europe in every role imaginable. Painted, black and fitted with radar, they hunted enemy night fighters. Stripped down, they became lightning-fast reconnaissance planes. Armed to the teeth, they shredded trains, convoys, and V-weapon launch sites, and always they outran pursuit. For the men in the cockpits, there was no greater thrill than watching German fighters spiral behind them, hopelessly outpaced. For the men in Berlin, there was no greater humiliation than hearing the wail of sirens, looking skyward and realizing the ghosts had returned. The Mosquito was not just one aircraft, it was many. Its wooden bones, light yet strong, became a canvas upon which British engineers painted dozens of possibilities. By the end of the war, over 40 distinct variants had flown, each proving that an airframe built for speed could also master versatility. The heart of the design was its simplicity, layers of spruce and balsa, doped and varnished, held together with precision carpentry. To many, it looked fragile, but in reality it was a miracle of efficiency. That strength allowed engineers to experiment without fear of losing what made the Mosquito special: speed. The bomber versions came first. Stripped of guns and armor, they carried 4,000 pounds of bombs deep into German territory at altitudes and speeds the enemy could scarcely match. Luftwaffe pilots scrambled to intercept, but the wooden ghost always slipped away. Soon, however, Britain realized the Mosquito could do more. Reconnaissance models followed, fitted with cameras instead of bombs. They flew alone at high altitude, capturing the first images of German V-weapon sites in northern France. Those photographs shaped Allied strategy, allowing bombers to strike rocket launchers before they could rain terror on London. The Mosquito's unarmed eye in the sky became as feared as its bombs.
Next came the night fighters.
Painted black, fitted with radar, and armed with cannons, they slipped into the darkness above Europe. Their prey was the German night fighter force, Bf 110s, Ju 88s, and Heinkel interceptors tasked with stopping Britain's nightly bomber streams. The duels were brutal, but one-sided. Mosquitoes would stalk their targets with radar, close, silently, then unleash a storm of 20mm shells before vanishing back into the night. German pilots nicknamed them Wooden Devils. Morale cracked as crews realized that even in the dark, they were no longer safe. But the Mosquito's versatility did not stop there. Pathfinder squadrons were born, their task to lead the heavy bombers into the heart of the Reich. Equipped with target-marking flares, they raced ahead of Lancaster and Halifax formations, painting German cities with eerie green and red lights. Behind them came the thunder of thousands of bombs, guided by the accuracy of the Wooden Wonder. Without the Mosquito, those raids would have scattered, wasted, or missed. With it, they hit with terrifying precision. Pilots often spoke of the strange beauty of the sight, a single fast aircraft diving low to drop its flares, followed by waves of giants thundering overhead, striking the marked target like hammers on an anvil. Even the sea became the Mosquito's hunting ground. Coastal Command fitted them with rockets and cannons, turning them into ship killers. German convoys hugging the French coast found themselves ambushed by aircraft that appeared out of nowhere, loosing a barrage of rockets before vanishing into the clouds. U-boats, once the terror of the Atlantic, now faced their own predator. Few things unnerved German sailors more than the sudden scream of Merlin engines over the waves. Perhaps the most daring role of all was low-level strike. Operation Jericho, the bombing of Amiens prison, became the stuff of legend. Mosquitoes roared in at treetop height, their wings skimming hedges, their shadows racing across fields. At just 50 feet above the ground, they dropped bombs with precision so exact that prison walls crumbled while cell blocks remained intact. 250 prisoners surged through the breach that day. The mission was filmed by gun cameras, later shown to the world as proof that speed and precision could achieve what brute force could not. For the crews, it was a miracle of planning and nerve. For the Germans, it was a nightmare. Fortresses could no longer guarantee safety. What made the Mosquito so adaptable was not just its design, but its production. Built in furniture shops, piano factories, and coachworks, each plane carried the fingerprints of craftsmen who had never touched an aircraft before the war. Cabinet makers bent wood into wing spars, carpenters sanded fuselages, and women lacquered panels with marine varnish. Every detail spoke of ingenuity, a nation harnessing not just factories, but culture itself. Where the Germans relied on steel mills and aircraft monopolies, Britain relied on its tradition of craftsmanship. In this, the Mosquito was as much a cultural triumph as a technological one. The adaptability even reached beyond combat. Mosquitoes became couriers, whisking critical personnel and documents across the continent, at unmatched speed. They became weather scouts, racing ahead of bomber streams to measure conditions. They became trainers and target tugs, preparing new generations of pilots and gunners. In every role, they retained the same essence: speed, efficiency, and elegance. No aircraft in the war matched this breadth of service, and with every new role, German frustration grew. Diaries of Luftwaffe officers describe the despair of trying to counter an aircraft that could not be pinned down. Build heavier fighters, and the Mosquito outran them. Build lighter interceptors, and it outclimbed them. Send flak, and it flew too high.
Send night fighters, and it struck in daylight.
The Mosquito was everywhere, yet nowhere, never in numbers large enough to destroy the Reich alone, but always enough to prove that Germany's defenses could be penetrated at will. By 1945, the Mosquito had written itself into legend. Over 7,700 were built, serving in Europe, the Mediterranean, Burma, and the Pacific. They bombed Berlin, photographed Peenemünde, hunted night fighters, and blasted U-boats. They carried diplomats, rescued prisoners, and even transported film reels to London in time for news broadcasts. Their versatility was unmatched, their impact undeniable. Pilots called them thoroughbreds, demanding, dangerous, but exhilarating. Historians today call them revolutionary, the blueprint for every multi-role aircraft that followed. The legacy of the Mosquito lay not only in the war it helped win, but in the lesson it left behind. Speed and versatility could defeat size and tradition. Ingenuity could triumph over brute force. And sometimes, the wildest gamble, the idea dismissed as folly, could become the weapon that turned the tide. For Germany, the Mosquito was a ghost they could never catch. For Britain, it was proof that imagination, when paired with courage, could change the course of history. In the winter of 1943, as the Reich staggered under the weight of Allied bombing, the Mosquito became more than just an aircraft. It became a phantom that haunted the German psyche. For pilots, commanders, and even civilians, it represented something terrifyingly new. A plane that should not have existed, built of wood when the Reich swore only steel could survive, yet somehow faster, deadlier, and everywhere at once. Its presence in the skies above Berlin and Cologne and Hamburg tore open not only physical defenses but psychological ones too. The Luftwaffe was trained to fight bombers with escorts, to measure strength in guns and armor. But what defense could be mounted against speed itself? Against an enemy that appeared suddenly, struck with precision, and vanished before a response could even be launched? The Mosquito wasn't just a military weapon, it was a message, whispered into the ears of those who had once believed in German superiority. You are not untouchable. Reports began to pile up on the desks of Luftwaffe command. Interceptions attempted and unsuccessful. Bombs dropped on Gestapo headquarters in Oslo with surgical precision. Cameras returning with images of V-weapon sites that no German had ever revealed. The language of those reports shifted over time, from annoyance to disbelief to outright despair. Some units even joked bitterly that to chase a Mosquito was to sign one's resignation papers. By the time a Messerschmitt 109 had clawed up to altitude, the target was already gone. Hermann Göring, who once mocked the wooden plane as a fantasy, grew so enraged that he reportedly slammed his fist against the conference table in front of his officers. I turn green with envy when I see the Mosquito, he confessed, in one of his more candid moments. That remark, captured in multiple post-war memoirs, spoke volumes. Here was the man who had promised Hitler total dominance of the skies, admitting he was outclassed by furniture makers. For Göring, the insult was deeply personal. The Luftwaffe was his creation, his empire within the Reich, the branch of service that had made him powerful. And yet every time Berlin's air raid siren screamed in the middle of a speech, every time a Mosquito's bombs rattled his headquarters, every time German propaganda was interrupted by the roar of Merlin engines overhead, the humiliation deepened. He could not admit defeat to his Führer, but among his generals he raged and fumed, searching for excuses. He blamed faulty radar. He blamed sluggish pilots. He blamed the weather, even fate, but never himself. The truth was harder. He had dismissed the warnings, ridiculed the very concept of a wooden aircraft, and now he was paying the price. Hitler, too, felt the sting. To him, the Mosquito was an aberration, a plane that contradicted the core principles of Nazi ideology. The Reich believed in strength through steel, in racial hierarchy, in the dominance of German engineering. But the Mosquito was British, crafted by carpenters and piano builders, flown by young men who carried no guns but carried out missions with devastating efficiency. Its very existence was an insult to the myth of Aryan superiority. Hitler dismissed reports of its speed and versatility as exaggerated propaganda designed to sap German morale. Yet the raids continued week after week, month after month, until even he could not ignore the reality. Diaries from officers in Hitler's Wolfschanze headquarters describe moments when the Führer's temper flared at the mere mention of the Mosquito, his denial clashing with the undeniable evidence of smoldering cities and broken defenses. For the average German civilian, the Mosquito's psychological effect was just as powerful. Heavy bombers like the Lancaster or B-17 arrived in massive formations, preceded by sirens and warnings, their approach obvious. But the Mosquito struck with almost no warning. Its speed meant sirens often wailed only moments before the bombs fell. For those living in Berlin or Hamburg, the wooden aircraft became a phantom, an omen of sudden destruction. "We called it the ghost plane," wrote one German woman after the war. "It came fast, it came low, and then it was gone. You could not prepare, you could only fear." This fear seeped into morale, eroding the illusion that the Reich could protect its people. Inside the Luftwaffe itself, despair grew sharper with each passing month. Fighter aces who once boasted of hunting Spitfires and Hurricanes now admitted bitterly that the Mosquito was a different beast altogether. Its top speed of nearly 400 miles per hour meant that even the latest models of the Messerschmitt 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 struggled to catch it, especially at altitude. Night fighter crews, tasked with protecting German cities from nocturnal raids, described the futility of watching radar blips appear and vanish before they could scramble. One pilot wrote in his diary, "To chase them is to chase the wind. We waste fuel, we waste lives, but we catch nothing." Such entries reveal the crushing sense of helplessness spreading among men who had once believed themselves masters of the skies. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, later admitted that the Mosquito represented everything the Nazis had failed to understand about modern warfare. In post-war interrogations, he described how Goering and Hitler mocked the reports, dismissing them as lies, while German engineers begged for resources to develop a counter. But the Reich was obsessed with heavy, over-engineered machines, the Me-262 jet, the V-2 rocket, while Britain's Mosquito proved that simplicity, versatility and speed were the real keys to survival. Speer wrote, "The Mosquito was more than an aircraft. It was proof that our enemies understood war better than we did." That realization, kept hidden during the war, became clear only in hindsight. But for those in Germany at the time, the aircraft's success was felt in every raid, every failed interception, every night spent staring at the skies in vain. Psychologically, the Mosquito also delivered another kind of wound, humiliation by timing. The raids that interrupted Goering's speeches were not accidents. They were deliberate, designed to show the world, and Germany itself, that the Reich's leaders were powerless. Imagine the effect. Citizens gathering to hear their leaders speak of strength and victory, only to hear the roar of engines and the thunder of bombs cut those words short. Such symbolic strikes carried a weight far greater than the tonnage of explosives. They undermined faith in leadership, spread whispers of weakness, and reminded everyone that the enemy could strike the heart of the Reich at will. For a regime built on myth and spectacle, the embarrassment was devastating. The despair filtered downward. German engineers, working tirelessly on new interceptors, confessed in private that no aircraft could truly outpace the Mosquito without sacrificing fuel or firepower. In memos buried deep in the archives, they describe the dilemma. To catch the Mosquito, we must build something faster. But to build something faster, we must strip away the guns and armor that make it a fighter. We would only build another Mosquito, and we have neither the resources nor the time. In other words, the Reich was trapped. They could not match what Britain had built, not with steel shortages, not with bombed factories, not with a leadership unwilling to believe in the impossible. By 1944, as Allied bombing intensified, the Mosquito's legend had grown beyond fact. German troops whispered about it as if it were supernatural, a ghostly presence that came and went without warning. Propaganda officers tried to downplay its success, but even their words carried a nervous edge. The wooden wonder had become a symbol of inevitability, a reminder that the Reich's days were numbered. Some German officers even began referring to their struggle not as a war of attrition, but as a war of mathematics. Every Mosquito sortie proved that Britain and America could outproduce, outthink, and outfly them. And mathematics, unlike ideology, could not be argued away. For Goering, the humiliation reached a breaking point. In late meetings, his anger erupted into open despair. He admitted privately that the Mosquito made him green with envy, and that no German pilot could hope to match it. His words, remembered in memoirs and post-war testimony, reveal the depth of his frustration. This was not just about aircraft. It was about pride, about the failure of an entire system of belief. The Luftwaffe, once his crowning achievement, was now powerless. And the instrument of that humiliation was not a massive bomber or a revolutionary jet. It was a wooden plane, born of imagination and perseverance, that Germany had dismissed as folly. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the ruins of Europe bore testimony to countless machines of war, tanks rusting in fields, bombers wrecked on airstrips, artillery scattered like bones across scarred landscapes. But among all the weapons that defined the conflict, one stood apart not by sheer size or destructive power, but by elegance and ingenuity. The Mosquito, the wooden wonder, had carved a legacy that transcended its wooden frame. It was not simply another aircraft. It was a revelation that war could be fought and won, not only with brute strength, but with imagination. Its story carried lessons not only for aviation, but for leadership, innovation, and the very idea of what a democracy could achieve under pressure. The Mosquito's legacy begins with speed. At a time when most nations equated strength with steel and armor, the Mosquito proved that agility could be a weapon in itself. It was faster than the Spitfire, faster than the Messerschmitt 109, faster even than many of the first-generation jets that appeared at the war's end. In this, it rewrote the rules of aerial combat. It demonstrated that speed, maneuverability, and versatility could compensate for, and often outclass, sheer firepower. For decades after the war, air forces around the world studied its design, recognizing that the Mosquito had anticipated the jet age before jets themselves had fully arrived. The very concept of the multi-role aircraft, a single platform able to switch between bombing, reconnaissance, interception, and more, traced its lineage back to the wooden ghost that haunted the Reich. But speed alone was not the lesson. The Mosquito also embodied the power of adaptability. Over 40 distinct variants flew, each tailored to a specific need. Bombers that slipped past radar at treetop level, night fighters that prowled the skies in black coats of paint, reconnaissance versions that photographed German rocket sites, pathfinders that lit targets for thousands of heavy bombers, and maritime strike aircraft that shredded shipping lanes with rockets. Its wooden skeleton absorbed these transformations without losing its essential character. In this, the Mosquito anticipated the future of aircraft design, machines built not for a single purpose, but as platforms capable of endless reinvention. Modern multi-role fighters like the F-16, the Rafale, or the F-35 owe something to the idea first tested with Spruce and Balsa in Britain's darkest hour. Yet perhaps the most profound lesson of the Mosquito was not about technology but about society. Nazi Germany dismissed the very possibility of such an aircraft because it could not fit into their ideology. Their worldview insisted that strength came from hierarchy, from purity of race, from steel forged in massive factories. Britain's answer was the opposite, a collective effort that mobilized every corner of society. Furniture makers, piano builders, women entering the workforce for the first time, immigrants working side by side in workshops, all contributed to the Mosquito's creation. This democratic mobilization was something the Reich could not match, not because they lacked resources, but because they lacked imagination and inclusion. The Mosquito, in this sense, was not just an aircraft. It was a weapon forged from freedom itself. It was proof that diversity, creativity, and collaboration could achieve miracles that authoritarian rigidity never could. For the men who flew it, the Mosquito left a personal legacy. Pilots described it as a nervous thoroughbred, a machine that demanded total focus but rewarded mastery with survival and even joy. "You didn't fly a Mosquito," one said after the war. "You danced with it." Veterans remembered the exhilaration of outrunning interceptors, of skimming treetops at impossible speeds, of knowing they were flying something so unique it turned fear into pride. Many survived missions they would never have dared attempt in slower, heavier aircraft. The Wooden Wonder gave them not just a fighting chance, but in many cases their lives. Its reputation endured in reunions and memoirs, not merely as a machine of war, but as a companion that had carried them through hell. The German perspective tells the other half of the legacy. Diaries of Luftwaffe pilots, intelligence officers, and even Albert Speer himself reveal the bitterness of facing an enemy weapon they could neither match nor explain. To them, the Mosquito was a symbol of humiliation, proof that the Reich's faith in racial superiority and technological arrogance was misplaced. Goering's infamous remark about turning green with envy was echoed in countless private admissions that the Luftwaffe had no answer. For a regime built on myth, the Mosquito was reality crashing through the door. Its speed, its efficiency, its versatility, these were arguments no ideology could counter. And in that realization lay a painful lesson. Denial of truth is fatal, no matter how powerful one believes oneself to be. After the war, the Mosquito's influence spread quietly but profoundly. In Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, factories continued producing variants even as peace dawned, proof of its global reach. In peacetime, it became a courier, a research platform, even a civilian transport. Some flew as aerial surveyors, mapping continents with the same cameras that once photographed rocket sites. Others carried mail or passengers, linking distant parts of the Commonwealth. In these roles, the Mosquito proved again that ingenuity was never wasted. Even a machine born in war could serve peace. Historians today often speak of the Mosquito as a metaphor. It symbolized Britain's war itself, underestimated, doubted, dismissed, and yet, through sheer resilience and creativity, it triumphed. Its wooden body was fragile yet strong, humble yet sophisticated, ordinary yet extraordinary. In it, one sees the spirit of a nation that refused to yield, that chose to gamble everything on an idea, and by doing so, changed the course of history. For Germany, the Mosquito was a ghost. For Britain, it was hope made real. For the world, it was a lesson that technology alone does not win wars. Imagination and values do. At the 1985 dedication of the Mosquito Memorial at Hatfield, veterans gathered to pay tribute. Among them were former pilots, engineers, and even German adversaries who had once tried to bring the plane down. One Luftwaffe veteran, speaking quietly to a British pilot, admitted what thousands of Germans had felt, but never said during the war. "We hated your Mosquito. Not because it killed us, but because it proved you were better than us when it mattered." The British pilot, now grey-haired, only smiled. "It wasn't us," he said. "It was the plane. She was our miracle." The final lesson of the Mosquito is as relevant today as it was in 1940. That sometimes the most radical ideas, the ones dismissed as folly, are the ones that change everything. That courage is not only found in battle, but in daring to imagine something different. And that freedom, messy and diverse and unorthodox, can forge weapons of victory more powerful than any dictator's command. The Mosquito was not built in giant steel mills, not designed by rigid doctrine, not bound by convention. It was built in workshops and furniture factories, designed by men willing to risk their reputations and flown by pilots willing to trust in speed over firepower.
That gamble paid off.
In the end, the Mosquito left behind more than wreckage and statistics. It left behind an idea that in the face of overwhelming odds, imagination can become the sharpest blade. And in its wooden wings, in its daring missions, in its uncatchable speed, the Mosquito carried the truth that even in war, the simplest materials, wood, glue, fabric, can create legends. It remains to this day one of the most extraordinary aircraft ever built, a ghost in the skies that continues to remind us that history is written not only by the strongest, but by the boldest. When the war ended and the smoke cleared from Europe's skies, the Mosquito stood not only as a warplane, but as a symbol of what imagination had achieved under desperate pressure. Its wooden wings had carried it from the fields of Hatfield to the skies above Berlin, from the jungles of Burma to the icy waters of the North Sea. Yet in peacetime, the question became, what was to be done with a machine born for war but built on ideas that transcended it? The answer lay in a legacy that stretched far beyond 1945, shaping aviation, culture, and memory for generations to come. In the immediate aftermath, thousands of Mosquitoes remained in service. The Royal Air Force retained them for reconnaissance, transport, and even as night fighters during the early Cold War years. In Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, production lines continued briefly, a reminder of how global the project had become. Civilian versions emerged, carrying passengers and mail across vast distances at speeds rivaling modern airliners of the time. For isolated communities, these sleek wooden aircraft were more than machines. They were lifelines, connecting towns and cities across continents with unprecedented speed. Where once they had carried bombs, they now carried doctors, supplies, and hope. But the Mosquito's greatest post-war legacy was in the lessons it left for aviation design. Engineers across the world studied its construction with awe. Here was an aircraft that had used non-strategic materials, wood, glue, varnish, yet had outperformed machines made of steel and aluminum. For nations rebuilding under shortages, that lesson mattered. It proved that advanced engineering did not always require the rarest metals or the largest factories, but clever design and the will to think differently. The Mosquito had, in many ways, been the first systems aircraft, one that integrated speed, versatility, and production ingenuity into a single package. Modern multi-role jets, with their ability to switch from bombing to interception to reconnaissance, trace a conceptual lineage back to the wooden wonder. Yet even as its influence spread, the Mosquito itself began to fade from active service. By the 1950s, jets had taken over, and propeller-driven aircraft seemed relics of a bygone era. Many Mosquitoes were scrapped, their wooden bodies left to rot in fields or hangars. Only a handful survived, preserved by museums or saved by enthusiasts who recognized what history might forget. For those who had flown them, watching the aircraft disappear was painful. Veterans who gathered at reunions spoke of the Mosquito not just as a machine, but as a companion. "She saved my life more than once," one pilot recalled. "I trusted her with everything." Their affection was almost personal, as if the aircraft itself had been alive, carrying them through missions no steel bomber could have survived. In Germany, the Mosquito's memory lingered as something more bitter. Post-war interrogations revealed the depth of frustration it had caused. Albert Speer admitted that he envied the Allies for producing such a machine, confessing that Nazi ideology had blinded German leadership to what was possible. Goering's own infamous line about turning green with envy was repeated endlessly in memoirs, a symbol of humiliation. To the Germans who had fought it, the Mosquito became shorthand for a war they could never win, a reminder that imagination had triumphed over arrogance. For Allied veterans, however, it became shorthand for pride. They had flown the wooden ghost, and in doing so had left an indelible mark on history. Culturally, the Mosquito's legend continued to grow. It appeared in films, documentaries, and books, often portrayed as a daring, almost mythical machine. Operation Jericho, the raid on Amiens prison, was dramatized as one of the most audacious missions of the war. In popular imagination, the Mosquito became the aircraft of courage, the plane that defied expectations and embarrassed tyranny. Even its wooden frame became part of its mystique. In an age obsessed with steel, it was the humble materials of carpenters and craftsmen that carried victory through the skies. Furniture shops, piano factories, coachworks, these unlikely places had built an aircraft that rewrote history. That fact resonated long after the war, a metaphor for resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. By the 1980s and 1990s, enthusiasts began restoring surviving Mosquitoes to flight. Crowds gathered at air shows to hear the roar of twin Merlin engines once again. For those who remembered the war, it was like seeing a ghost return, sleek and fast, skimming low over the fields as it once had over Berlin. For younger generations, it was a glimpse into a past that felt impossibly daring. These restorations became symbols of historical memory, reminders that the Wooden Wonder was not just a story in books, but a real machine that once carried men into the heart of danger. At the dedication of memorials, veterans often wept, recalling comrades lost and missions flown. "She was beautiful," one old pilot whispered, gazing up at the polished wood and gleaming varnish. "The most beautiful plane I ever flew." The Mosquito's modern legacy also extends to leadership and strategy. Historians studying the conflict note that it embodied a principle too often overlooked, that innovation thrives when leaders are willing to take risks. The Air Ministry nearly killed the project multiple times, but Air Marshal Wilfred Freeman staked his career on it, refusing to let skepticism prevail. His gamble paid off, and his legacy is bound forever to the Mosquito. The lesson is clear: in war, as in peace, the boldest ideas are often the ones that succeed. That lesson resonates in boardrooms, laboratories, and governments to this day. Freeman's folly became Britain's triumph, and the world has never forgotten. Today, the Mosquito remains a touchstone for aviation enthusiasts, historians, and storytellers. Its surviving examples are revered like relics, meticulously maintained by museums in Britain, Canada, and beyond. Documentaries retell its story with awe, highlighting not only its technical feats, but the human spirit behind it. Writers and filmmakers continue to be drawn to its paradox, a plane of wood that conquered a world of steel. To those who seek inspiration, it offers something timeless, proof that genius often hides in the unlikeliest of places. The Mosquito's final legacy may be the most profound of all, the reminder that freedom itself is fertile ground for innovation. Britain built it not by suppressing ideas, but by allowing bold thinkers to try. It mobilized not just soldiers and factories, but civilians, women, immigrants, craftsmen, everyone who could contribute. In that sense, the Mosquito was not only an aircraft, but a symbol of democratic strength. It showed that diversity and imagination could outfly tyranny. For every German who cursed it, for every British pilot who loved it, for every civilian who looked up and saw it streak across the sky, the Mosquito carried a message that resilience, courage, and creativity could turn the tide of history. Even now, more than 80 years after its first flight, the Mosquito inspires awe. It was fragile yet unbreakable, simple yet revolutionary, a contradiction that became triumph. Its wooden wings carried not just bombs and cameras, but the hopes of a nation and the proof that arrogance can be humbled by imagination. In museums, in books, in the memories of those still alive to remember, it remains more than a plane. It remains a ghost, a wonder, and a legend. The Mosquito endures as one of the clearest lessons of World War II, that innovation is not about resources or ideology, but about daring to believe in what others call impossible.